An explosive night in Russia.
A strike on the thermal power plant in Oryol, a fire is burning under the station in Vladimir region, and in Yaroslavl there are detonations at Slavneftyanos. And
in Oryol, residents have been left without electricity altogether. US nuclear tests. Russia's in danger.
But a major part of America's national security is making sure that this nuclear arsenal we have is in fact functioning properly, and that's part of the testing regime.
Russia attacks Ukraine with a nuclear-armed missile. Europe is next.
Debris was found in the Lviv region. The missile traveled more than 1,200 kilometers.
The Kremlin old man started talking about a ceasefire at the front, but only a temporary one.
But only in areas where, according to his version, Ukrainian troops are allegedly surrounded. We
are ready to stop hostilities for a certain period for several hours.
It seems the unparalleled air defense can't cope. There are new job openings in Russia.
The Russian Ministry of Defense has announced the recruitment of volunteers for mobile fire teams to protect oil refineries from drone attacks.
Less money, less motivation. Payments are being cut in the Russian Federation.
Payments to contract soldiers have recently been reduced, going from a previous amount of 2 million rubles down to just 400,000 rubles. This significant decrease is entirely due to a regional budget deficit, which has forced local authorities to make these difficult financial decisions.
33 billion rubles is an extremely large sum of money. The ruble is the official currency of Russia, and when we talk about 33 billion of them, we are referring to a financial amount that could have a major impact. Such a sum could be used to fund important projects, support economic development, or provide resources for public services. This figure highlights the scale of the financial resources involved and shows just how significant this amount is in the context of the Russian economy. Many people are now asking, thanks to what? What types of weaponry? Let's take a look at the details in the report, and then we'll discuss it exclusively in the studio.
Distances of hundreds or even thousands of kilometers are no obstacle for Ukrainian weapons. Russian oil refineries, well, that's it. It's obvious the refineries are fucked. That's clear even without saying it. Key facilities of the military-industrial complex and the Russian war machine. And recently, in response to the ongoing shelling of Ukraine's civilian infrastructure, critical Russian infrastructure has also come under fire from the Ukrainian armed forces.
Yeah, well, Barish, look, where are we going? What a ride this is. Yeah,
When the Kremlin threatens Ukrainians with blackouts, Russians should also prepare for a cold and harsh winter. If they threaten blackouts, for example, in the capital of Ukraine, the Kremlin should realize that a blackout will also come to the Russian capital. For a long time, Western allies restricted Ukraine's ability to strike deep into Russian territory. As a result, Ukraine has built up its own long-range arsenal. According to the head of Ukrainian intelligence, Kirilo Budanov, today 99% of strikes on Russian oil refineries are carried out with Ukrainian weapons. At the time when all this started, when people said we were fighting with one hand tied behind our back, I tend to agree with your view that this is the right interpretation of what was happening then. But now we have our own production, and it is precisely our domestic production that has given us the ability to use our own forces and resources, the way we see fit. In the Kremlin, they only understand the language of force. The best argument in any negotiations with Moscow is a powerful Ukrainian army and military-industrial complex. In particular, the domestic production of long-range drones and missiles with which Ukraine regularly strikes targets in Russia, located thousands of kilometers or more from the front line.
In order to somehow bring this war to a stalemate, to shift it, we need to learn not only to repel attacks, to push back the enemy on the front line, but also to suppress their logistics and their aviation. That's why it became necessary. And I'm not even mentioning the need to strike at Russia's military-industrial enterprises and energy system.
This is Belgorod, basically. Damn, there's no power here, nowhere in Belgorod at all.
If the simplest drones to manufacture are used for strikes on Russian oil refineries, jet-powered drones are better suited for military-industrial targets, like the Polyanitsia, Peklo, and Bars types. Their technical specifications are not disclosed. Experts suggest that the range of these jet-powered drones is between 500 and 700 kilometers. The main advantage is their low cost compared to cruise missile competitors.
Two such places.
Two cities like Moscow and Leningrad, which are the most protected by the Russian Federation's air defense systems, could start getting hit every evening. The bar can reach them, and I believe this should happen systematically. For dessert, Ukrainian long-range missiles are in store for the occupiers. The long-range Neptunes and Flamingos have ranges of 1,000 and 3,000 kilometers respectively. The Ukrainian Pink Bird, in addition to its enormous range, impresses with a warhead weight of about 1,000 kilograms.
Usually the warhead of a modern cruise missile is 450, but at most 500 kilograms. As a rule, almost all missiles have a 450 kilogram warhead. What does a 1-ton warhead provide?
When it hits a target, for example, an industrial facility, two such missiles can completely disable it for at least a year. That is, there will be a single crater about 20 meters in diameter.
Russian terrorists who are shelling Ukrainian cities must realize that the mirrored strike is inevitable.
Next, we are joined by Roman Svitan, military expert and retired colonel of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. Roman Grigorievich, hello, it's good to see you. Thank you for finding the time.
I wish everyone good health.
Pokrovsk is on everyone's lips these last few days. That's understandable. And today, President Zelensky gave an answer about whether Ukraine plans to withdraw its troops from the Pokrovsk area. What is your analysis? What does your intuition tell you? Will the armed forces of Ukraine be able to withstand this deadly onslaught of Russian occupation forces? Today, Zelensky mentioned a figure. About 170,000 Russian occupiers are currently focused specifically on this direction.
Well, at a minimum, over 100,000 are directly involved in combat operations or supporting these combat actions. Basically, the main 500,000 strong Russian army is backing up this 100,000. That's at the very least, depending on the direction. That's why there are large forces concentrated there, and the fact that they're gathering there has been clear since the spring of this year. In other words, the main direction, the main axis of attack was precisely the Zaporizhzhia and Donetsk regions, the Eastern Front. The main objective is to expand the land corridor. And to expand the land corridor, that is to reach the Azov coast, the Russians need at least 150 kilometers in order to deploy a serious air defense system. So that our, for example, anti-radiation missiles like HARM can't reach this system. Their range is just about 150 kilometers. So this line is roughly around Zaporizhzhia. Naturally, along the land corridor, practically along its entire length, Russian troops were deployed. The second wave has arrived recently, at least the equipment has, and now more than 100,000 will be involved. This was already clear as early as spring, meaning the overall strategic direction. But in reality, after the second wave moved out mainly to the line of contact, it took at least a month and a half to 2 months. That's why encirclement could not be allowed. This could have been done by sending a sufficient number of troops in that direction to increase both the density of fire and naturally the density of personnel. But of course, to do that, it would have been necessary to withdraw forces from elsewhere, to remove the security forces reserve, to put into action some of the security forces that are not currently needed for maintaining order within the country. There is such a contingent because since half the population has left our country, at least 50% of our law enforcement system could manage with the remaining half, and the other 50% could be rotated into the armed forces of Ukraine, just as is done in Israel. The Israeli model is the best in this regard, where it is simply impossible to get a government job without having served in the army. And in politics as well. Even Netanyahu, if I'm not mistaken, holds the rank of captain in the IDF. So it's not all that simple, right? We need to have a well-established system like that. But at the moment, I'll just say, as they say, it's my opinion, mine. In other words, over the past few months, the Russians have created a serious threat to our Pokrovsk Mirnograd garrison. And this threat mainly comes from the north. That is, from the north, meaning the Russians are advancing from the direction of... There was an attempt to break through from Rodinske towards Pokrovsk from the north, and from the south they recently reached Shevchenko. These are successful advances. They've been there for a while already. In principle, it's possible to hold them back there, at least south of the railway and from the southwest towards Pokrovsk as well, that is between Mezhova and Pokrovsk. But the advance from the north, from Rodinske, is much more dangerous, although it is also risky for the Russians themselves, because this is the northern pincer that is now trying to encircle Mirnograd, south of Rodinske. They have entered part of Rodinske as well. This pincer is dangerous for the Russians too. Why? because a similar pincer tried to break through to rush into Dobropilya. It was squeezed from both sides, that is, from the flanks, and now in several semi-encirclements in pockets, it is being broken down into its components. In other words, this pincer is being destroyed, and the same thing would happen if there were at least a couple of full-fledged corps present. And if Ushursky has something stashed away somewhere, then in principle, the Pokrovsk-Myrnograd problem could be solved. It might be possible to completely unblock at least the northern part of the Pokrovsk-Myrnograd agglomeration. And then, of course, for several months, it will be necessary to defend those Russian groups that have already entered Pokrovsk from the south and Myrnograd from the south and northeast. So such an opportunity does exist, but again, it depends on whether we have at least a couple of corps, again, fully equipped corps to carry out such a task. If we don't have these corps, if we don't have reserves, then we need to make a decision for an organized withdrawal before it's too late. Because right now there are two options, so to speak. Within the next week, it will become clear. We can create a major problem for the Russians there, definitely. Why are the Russians now requesting several hours of an operational pause? They don't need to bring journalists in there. What they really need is an operational pause to regroup.
Roman Grigorievich, what could they manage to do? Obviously, this is a military trick. But what could they accomplish from a military standpoint? In 5 to 6 hours?
They could manage it. First of all, 5 to 6 hours, that's just what was said. In reality, to bring journalists in there, they'd have to stop for several days. Cease hostilities, keep things under control. It's an entire process. No one can get anything done in just a few hours, including with journalists too. But even if it's 5 or 6 hours, in that time, they can regroup those Russian units that have currently entered Pokrovsk, and they don't even have communication with each other yet. Why? Because our electronic warfare systems, our jammers are working. They don't let them communicate with each other. They don't let them connect with the main Russian units that are located further south near Pokrovsk. And that's why naturally there's a ceasefire regime. A ceasefire would allow the Russians to regroup inside Pokrovsk to bring them together into larger groups. Right now, there are, let's say, about 30 or several dozen Russians there. But if they regroup them into companies and battalions, they could take up certain positions, having already decided on them, and that's enough. In this current state, that's sufficient. But if we don't do this, then we have a question there now. Additional units have been sent there to clear out these Russians, and within a week, they can be eliminated. The Russians understand this perfectly well, and so does Putin. That's why he's going to go for this trick, a so-called operational pause lasting several hours, which will simply be dragged out for several days. And if you give them a few days of operational pause, they'll be able to bring up reserves. And that's exactly why they can't do anything extra in the Rodinskoye area. Then, having brought up enough reserves and restructured, they would take Rodinskoye. Otherwise, there would be pressure later on the flanks. So this is a classic trap, and under no circumstances should we fall for it. By the way, this is yet another indication that the Russians are having problems there, problems of about the same scale as ours.
Well, let's hope that the military and political leadership is keeping this situation under control. After all, they keep saying that it's still too early to talk about the situation being hopeless. Let's move on to some more positive news. Ukraine is intensifying its strikes deeper into Russian territory. Now, the strikes are happening almost on schedule, and that's encouraging. And it's pleasing to see, just in the past 24 hours, there have been hits in 3 regions of the Russian Federation at once. So a completely logical question arises. What is making all this possible today? Which weapons are primarily responsible?
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism, and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
You pointed that out correctly. We can already see a systematic and planned approach to combat operations. When we reach a planned approach to combat operations with systematic strikes following a certain algorithm, it's already been noticeable for the 3rd month now. This means that we've already shifted onto a real wartime footing. Frankly, we've started the war only in August of 25, a full-scale war. This happened right after the strikes began on the enemy's rear areas. No one has ever won a war anywhere without destroying the enemy's rear. It's simply impossible to win a war on the line of contact under the conditions of the 3rd millennium, only strikes on the rear. So we've only just started hitting them on a large scale, at least in a planned way, since August, and immediately the results started to show. 1/5 of Russia's oil industry has been knocked out, and war is mathematics. If you track the dynamics, then in a year for the Russians, that is by the fall of next year, or definitely by the end of the year, they simply won't have it anymore. The oil industry, what is the oil industry? The oil and gas sector of Russia. It's the main flow of oil and gas dollars into the Russian economy. In general, it's the industry that forms the backbone of the Russian economy, either directly or indirectly. Petrochemicals, metallurgy, energy, and so on all depend on the oil industry. The entire Russian economy is in politics. That is, further attacks on the Russian rear will make it possible in the end not only to destroy the Russian economy, but through the destruction of the Russian economy to destroy the Russian empire. Because this flow of oil dollars will stop. They buy an army, they buy loyalty. The leadership of the republics that are part of the Russian Federation will collapse just like the Soviet Union did. The strikes are now being carried out systematically, mainly on air targets. We don't have minutes yet. The police had ballistics. We already had it in Moscow. That is, while there are no ballistic missiles, the strikes are mainly carried out by drones and cruise missiles, mainly drones, a number of them. Here in the report, it was already mentioned, and to that, the Fierce and 196S were added. These are decent machines that carry out combat missions at a range of over 600 kilometers. By the way, our aircraft-type drone is hard to stop. The missiles that are now being used in large quantities are targeting Russian military facilities and now also infrastructure and economic targets. Those same Neptune struck several targets, including at long range. For example, the Orlovka TS has a range of over 400 kilometers, which means the long-range Neptune was already in use, at least that's what it's called. Or recently, they showed the Neptune with so-called conformal tanks. Those are additional external fuel tanks in the area of the fuselage, which make it possible to launch strikes at over 400 kilometers. And here, the basic Neptune has a range of about 300 kilometers, so the Neptunes are operational. This is a coastal missile system developed by KB Luch, and they manufacture the missiles. At one time, based on the X-35 and X-35U missiles, KB Luch developed the Neptune missile, which was initially designed to target ships from the air. That is, it was air-launched. Later, it was adapted for use on the launchers of the coastal missile system. Now, in addition to striking ships, it is also being used for other types of strikes. It was used to sink the Moskva and for other strikes, and now it also performs ground-to-ground missions, destroying Russian military targets. Well, at a range of 400 kilometers behind enemy lines, it's already a serious cruise missile. That's regarding the Neptune. And there is information that it's about to take off at least the pre-production tests, the so-called prototypes, up to about 10 units. Only 10 successful launches with completed combat missions are needed, and then it can go into mass production. The same goes for the Flamingo missile. It has a decent warhead. They approached it very correctly and skillfully. They took an aerial bomb, roughly attached engines, wings, and a control system to it. It's an aerial bomb with a jet engine, specifically the AI-25TL. I logged 1,500 flight hours on that engine. It was installed on the L-39, and it still is. And thousands of these engines have been produced over the past 40 years. Even over 50 years, actually. It's been about half a century already. Our Zaporizhzhia Production Association has manufactured thousands of these engines. Now they're just lying around gathering dust. They were removed from aircraft, and in principle, they can be restored for a single use for one flight. Basically, it's a cheap missile with a one-ton warhead. But the FAB-1000 is a very serious bomb, meaning it really delivers the impact of a single bomb. It's enough, for example, to disrupt or halt the technological process at facilities like an oil refinery with just one aerial bomb. Or even as a missile, if it reaches its target, it's enough to shut down a metallurgical plant, say, by destroying the oxygen shop, or a petrochemical facility by taking out key preparation systems. In other words, hitting critical points. Or, for example, at an oil refinery, if you destroy the crude oil pretreatment unit, the desalination unit, or the distillation towers, the cracker, you can basically write off the entire facility. So this possibility does exist. The main thing is for the missile to actually reach its target. That's the problem right now. It's already difficult to break through Russian air defense, especially head-on. Russian air defense near the front, the so-called front line density, is increasing to the level of Moscow's and the Kerch Bridge, and it will keep increasing. So it's going to be serious there. We'll need to find ways to break through it so that our main strike missiles can get through and accomplish their combat missions. But there are no problems entering via Crimea and Novorossiysk. In other words, roughly speaking, from the sea at extremely low altitudes, missile drones can carry out combat missions in this southeastern direction. And then further on, nothing has been done there yet, so to speak, in military terms, meaning all the way to the Caspian Sea. The main thing is that the range allows it.
Well, once again, let's trust President Zelensky, our political leadership, and the military. who say that the defense forces are preparing new long-range strikes against Russia. And because we understand perfectly well that one of these missiles, or several missiles in the future, it is precisely these that are most likely to become those very black swans that could sweep away both Putin and his entire clique. But the enemy isn't letting up either, and information has emerged that Russia has begun launching the 9 M729 missile at Ukraine, which is capable of carrying nuclear warheads. What are the Russians demonstrating with this, and how critical is this situation, both for Ukraine and surely for Europe as well?
We need to be objective, and our cruise missiles are not a game changer. With dense air defense, Russian cruise missiles are absolutely not a game changer for our air defense, and even less so for Europe's. It is our ballistic missiles that will be a true black swan for Putin, because their air defense won't be able to shoot them down. They will reach Moscow. A blackout in Moscow would cut off Putin's control over the rest of the capital. Just the destruction of the Ostankino TV tower alone, shutting it down at the very least. For several days, this stream of lies that is pumped into Russian minds through television will be cut off. This is what will happen. That black swan, the same picture, but from a Russian cruise missile, a cruise missile that was developed decades ago. It was mounted on the same Iskander launcher, an upgraded version, of course, mounted on the Iskander launcher, but its range exceeded 500 kilometers, which was the limit set by the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. So the Russians were supposed to destroy it, but they didn't, even though they reported its destruction or they restarted its production. The production of these cruise missiles with ranges over 1,000 kilometers means they are considered intermediate range missiles, at least for ground-based deployment, and they simply shouldn't exist a priori. So naturally, the fact is that the Russians started using them. We're highlighting this so that it will be much easier for Trump to appeal, including to Congress. For example, when it comes to resolving the issue of launching nuclear tests or starting production, including ground-based intermediate-range missiles, in principle, they don't have them. Yours is the same AGAP, but essentially right now. At the moment, this is primarily a sea-based missile. There are several dozen launches there. These are the systems that are now trying to provide it with ground-based launches, but so far that's not enough. We need to withdraw completely from this treaty, launch nuclear tests, of course, and so on and so forth. Right now, that's exactly what we're helping with, meaning our information, which at the moment has been checked, double-checked, and we're making every effort. Trump will help launch this arms race, which the Russians definitely won't survive. China might survive it, but the Russians won't, just like the Soviet Union didn't survive it back in the day. If they enter it, they'll be forced to participate. If this race goes to a new level, a new round, they will definitely be trying to catch up to keep up with it. This requires a huge amount of funding, and the Russians can't afford it. This is once again one of the mechanisms for the collapse of the Russian Empire. That's why, of course, we will support Trump by providing him with additional information. Although by itself, a missile, well, what is a cruise missile, even with a range of over 1,000 kilometers? The Catch-101 has a range of 5,500 kilometers, or the Caliber, which has a range of over 2,000 kilometers. So that's the comparison of their ranges. In other words, a cruise missile launched from an Iskander ground-based system doesn't have enough power, so to speak, in its conventional version, even to surpass the main Russian missiles that are currently on combat duty. Because in terms of combat payload, of combat pressure, it's not particularly frightening. So for us, it's not a threat. And for Europe, it's really not a threat either. That's in its conventional version, but it can carry a nuclear warhead. In its nuclear version, yes, that's where the problem lies. That means at the very least, it will require a 100% response. That's one. Second, right now, it's important to start tracking, to launch a mechanism for monitoring the locations of the launches from which it can be fired. This is the main problem for Europeans at the moment.
Well, that's a bit reassuring, to be honest. Roman Grigorievich, thank you so much for taking the time and sharing your analysis. Let me remind our viewers that today my questions were answered by military expert, retired colonel of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Roman Svitan. Until next time.
Goodbye.